Okay, questions, please raise your hand. Don't all raise your hand at once. Okay, Mark's got a question.
Hold on, I'll just turn my reaction thing off. That's already gone off. Okay. So my question is about, I guess, just following on from the last presentation as well. So what is the ultimate objective of these methods? Is the idea to identify the quantity of response shift and sort of control it out so you can assess the quality of life impact of a catalyst? Because it seems like the previous presentation from Carolyn suggested that actually you want to kind of incorporate that response shift information into the quality of life assessment in some way. So I'm just, and I guess I'm hoping for some discussion of kind of what other people in this field think of response shift. Do they think of it as kind of a nuisance, like a bias, or do they think of it as an interesting thing to unpack and look at? Thanks.
Well, I really think, and I really join Carolyn by saying this, is that response shifts, well, can be, of course, considered as measurement bias, but I think it's much more than that. It's not measurement bias, it's really something interesting to study per se. And the idea when using different methods is that you can detect response shift, you can provide some interpretation on the response shift effects that you have detected. And you can also, if you want to focus only on change in the latent trait, for instance, try to adjust for the detected response shift in order to take into account response shift, but at the same time having a non-biased measurement. But I don't like the word bias when talking about because I don't think we should restrict the view of response shift only on this. And when you use these methods, you can do both. I mean, you can, of course, have a sort of measurement bias view saying, okay, I have a randomized clinical trial, for instance, and I really think that response shift might be a bias. And so I want to have an unbiased estimate of change in quality of life. And then I want to detect response shift, but I won't give any interpretation of response shift, and I will adjust change in quality of life on the detected response shift. But you can also take into consideration that you have response shift effects that you can interpret, and that it provides a lot of information and a lot of very relevant information. So it really depends on the view of the researcher and how he or she wants to really analyze the data and what is the aim of the study and the research.
Okay, thank you.
A hand up from Chris.
Can I pipe in for a second?
Oh, sorry. Yes, who's speaking?
Carolyn.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Hi, I just want to build on what Veronique said. We have a project going on with the Special Interest Group on Response Shift. It's one of 5 projects we're doing, and it's looking at the research literature and response shift and how methods frame the research question and interpret their results, and how much they're using terms like bias versus not bias. And just very preliminarily, what we're finding is that so much of the way response shift is talked about is dependent on the method being used. And so we're going to be proposing a glossary of terms using those methods that get away from terms like bias, because I think Veronique's point is very well taken. I don't think anyone feels that it's not important information. It's just, we're sort of chained to the methods that we're using. And they talk about, for example, with the Venn test, they call it response shift bias. With SEM, they call it trying to get at, quote, true change, as if what people are experiencing as change is not true. So it's a little bit fighting. I think it's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Is that the term of how language determines our experience? And if we can harness different terms in using these same methods, get away from this misrepresentation of what we're finding as quote bias, the field will be better off.
Chris?
Is that me?
Yeah, it's you.
I just loving this this conversation, and I'm going to have to follow up reading papers behind the last two talks, and maybe even watch them again. So I'm glad this is recorded. This kind of interdisciplinary crossover in language is really eye-opening. I like to mark Fabian's question just now, though, and I want to maybe re-ask it to Veronique. And so kind of posing maybe the disciplinary point of view. You know, by the way, economists are never asking only one question, right? Otherwise, you would not have anything to put on the right-hand side of our regressions, or i.e. left-hand side in psychology. We typically have many more than 80 questions on the surveys we're using, in fact. And so in some sense, the measures of quality of life include all of these aspects of lives, people's lives, objective and subjective, that we know typically when, and life satisfaction is used to organize them. And in a sense, what we're ultimately interested in is those effect sizes. And that is what tells us then ultimately that, at least on the population or group scale, tells us how good people's lives are for general sets of conditions. So I think there's maybe a bit more of, possibly more of an analogy there between how economists are thinking of what we're doing and say what Carolyn's talking about. But I think in our mind, we always have policy. So one very stark application of these kind of quality of life measures in the health context, say, is to be making policy decisions about where to allocate resources. And so I want to maybe sharpen Mark's question to Veronique by saying, how does one interpret response shift in the sense not of a researcher and of actually understanding in a deep qualitative sense what kind of experiences people are going through maybe, but actually to make judgment about which conditions should be treated first, which expenses need to be reallocated, because that actually does happen. And I'm wondering whether it makes sense to talk about quality of life and response shift measurement and understanding in terms of being able to make that kind of judgment.
Well, in fact, well, I hope I will be able to answer, but in fact, in our initiative in Team 4, a colleague was working on clinical applications of response shift at different types of granularity and levels, like you have micro, meso, and macro level. And so how response shift might impact the decision you will make based on patient-reported outcomes, for instance. And we can see that if you don't take into account response shift, if you don't try to interpret response shift, you might maybe allocate resources in the wrong way, because maybe you just miss that some way of treating people is not maybe the ideal way, because it doesn't really do them good, because in fact what you observe without taking response shift into account does not really reflect what is behind the data. And as such, if you don't take response shift into account, you might maybe, well, the way I'm thinking about it, try to convey the message is that interpretation response shift can show you, for instance, that you have change in life priorities. And that if you don't take these into account, maybe the way people are treated was a very good idea, before they were maybe, they had a declining health experience. and that now, after maybe several months, and the way they are treated is not the ideal way, because they change their priorities. And so there's maybe something important to take into account, such as side effects of some treatment, and that medical doctors have to take this into account in order to provide the best treatment at the best time. I don't know if I'm very clear, but it's, you know, a little bit the idea. I don't know if Miriam, you want to complete, because you were part of this team more than I was.
Can I just ask, isn't that the bias, the kind of the biased approach though, what you just described, that you're trying to correct for something in order to get at a true contingent value? I mean, that's what that sounded like.
You can't think about both, actually. You can think about bias and say, okay, I might overestimate or underestimate, for instance, change in quality of life. But also you can really try to examine response shift effects and try to interpret response shift effects. And when I'm talking about change in life priorities, for instance, it's really typically when we try to interpret response shift effects by looking, for instance, at change in factor loadings when using SEM. But yeah, so sorry, Miriam, maybe you want to...
You've explained it perfectly well, but I tend to agree with Chris that in those cases, if you do not take response into account and you need to take a medical, you need to make a medical decision, and you may take a biased decision. So I'm not as afraid as Carolyn is to call it bias, because as Veronique said, it depends on the research question, the context, what it is. Is it meaningful or is it biased? And if you are a researcher and you really want to look into the data, you can look at it in both ways. But I see it as a knife. A knife in the hands of a surgeon is a healing tool, and a knife in the hands of a murderer can kill. It's response shift is inherent to me, a neutral concept. It's only in the hands of whom whether it can be a bias or a meaningful measure, or both. And I think we all three, and perhaps Bruce too, plead for looking at the possibilities of doing research and making your research more meaningful. But surely it can be considered a bias in some contexts. Does this help, Chris?
This is all great. Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess from reflecting on how I mean, so one message I take away is there's not a single answer. I mean, there are different causes for response shifts, and you need judgment. Some of them will have different implications, and some of them will be things you want to correct for, and some will be insights that direct your policy elsewhere. In my view, those ones that are insights for something else, at least in my still slow to move life satisfaction thinking, those are just explaining the life satisfaction, right? So if somebody's priorities, values have changed, that's just explaining life satisfaction. That also gives you insight as to, I mean, you need to follow, if you understand those well enough, it means that you can improve people's lives by addressing them. But that's still in a world in which we have no choice really but to trust that life satisfaction. So, which is, you know, thank you.
I think Casper had his hand up. Yep, go on, Casper.
So yeah, first of all, sorry for the microphone malheur earlier. Yeah, so this is more of a clarification question, and that's kind of an attempt at trying to translate between disciplines. And I just want to verify whether this attempt at translation is correct. So am I right in understanding that what's called in the quality of life literature recalibration is really the sort of thing that sort of the economists here in the room have in mind with the response shift? That is, that, you know, just the way you use the scale kind of has shifted. You know, when I earlier talked about these thresholds, that recalibration is really just these thresholds moving about, whereas reprioritization and reconceptualization aren't response shifts in the sense possibly an economist would talk about them. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question connects then to Chris's question. Is it seems to me that the latter two types of what in the quality of life literature is called a response shift aren't things that are causing bias, but it's only the first one, the recalibration bit, that's causing bias. If what we're interested in is like this underlying thing that, you know, might be caused by certain priorities and certain concepts that people have in their head. Is that the right direction of trying to translate concepts?
I'm just going to ride on Casper's coattails for the last bit, because I think in the subjective well-being literature, we would tend to think of reprioritization and recontextualization as more like adaptation, but you're not changing your scales, you're just changing what you focus on. So let's say you play tennis and then you become disabled, okay, and then you play chess instead, but you could say your life satisfaction is flat the whole time because you don't really mind, or it might be that it changes. So changing what the bit that kind of, I think the subjective well-being people are concerned about is are you changing how you use your scale, which is a problem that makes the data incomparable. And the other thing is, okay, are you just changing which judgments you make to form your number on that scale?
Well, I try to remember all the questions. Regarding the first question you had, Casper, about the thresholds that you showed sooner today. Yes, recalibration is about the scale shrinking or stretching, or it depends on whether it shrinks or stretches in a similar way for all your response categories, or if it is different, but it's all about recalibration. And maybe I don't remember all the questions, but your question, Michael, and I think it joins the question you had, Casper, about adaptation. Well, there were a lot of vibrant and intense discussion about this, whether recalibration was just measurement bias and reprioritization and reconceptualization could be linked to adaptation. As a matter of fact, it seems that I don't know why recalibration could not be linked to adaptation, because, for instance, if you think about some kind of a fatigue level, and you have the same fatigue level before and after chemotherapy. And at the same time, when you look at some of the items regarding, for instance, mental fatigue, and you see the different response categories that are proposed to you, you can see that maybe some of the level of fatigue do not mean the same thing now after chemotherapy than before. And maybe it is because there maybe have been some sort of adaptation to fatigue. And so you may answer that your fatigue is maybe, you feel it as a little less, whereas it is the same as before. And this might be recalibration on an item scale. So this could maybe be thought of as being also linked to adaptation, as well as reprioritization and reconceptualization. Well, at least this is what I believe. I don't know if it answers your different questions. Maybe I forgot some, and in that case, I'm sorry.
I suppose the thing I'm concerned about is recalibration most of all, and whether you find evidence for that on the subjective well-being measures. So because there's this kind of worry that, okay, you say you're 7 out of 10, something terrible happens, you still say you're a 7 out of 10, but actually you feel lots worse because of your injury or whatever. And that's the kind, and I'm wondering, is there evidence of that sort of thing?
But that might be also linked to another thing, which is response bias, which is not response shift, like social disability. I mean, you want to, okay, you say you don't feel good, but then you don't want to answer that you don't feel, that you feel so bad. And so you will maybe rate a little higher, but this may not be linked to response shift. This might be an alternative explanation, maybe.
Okay, others have got their hands up. I think it was probably Alberto at the start of that list.
I think Mark Florbet was the first. Please.
Oh, okay. Sorry if I also, Mark, over to you then.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. My question is actually very short, but not easy to answer, perhaps. So thank you so much for sharing all this this field with us. I'm learning a lot. I just wanted to ask if you have any particular advice about what you think is most relevant for subjective well-being studies, and if you had to tell us what path, what priority we should put on various methods, what would you tell us?
Well, with regards to the methods, it's really difficult, as I said, to really identify the ideal method, as I think the ideal method doesn't really exist. As you know, Cox said, all models are wrong and some are useful. So we can recall that, I guess. But at the same time, if I could maybe give an advice on the measure of subjective well-being, is maybe to take into account the fact that response shifts might be there, and that it might be really important to try to look for it and to try to understand what is going on in a measure. And as the measure, I mean, when you study change, you might as well look at differential functioning of the different items. If you have a cross-sectional study, it's the same idea, actually, is that the perception of the items is not the same between groups or over time, or maybe both sometimes. So I think it really seems to be important to, as you have an evaluative measure, to look at the possibility for, well, measurement non-invariance, whether it be differential item functioning or response shift, or maybe even both. Now, yeah, in addition, with regards to the best method, it depends on also how you conceptualize your measure and whether you think, you know, try to think about it regarding the measurement model that you want to use. Do you think of it as a formative measure or a reflective measure? It's more like a conceptual reflection to make before, to see what would be the best approach, the best methodological approach to try to measure what the latent construct you're interested in. Okay, I hope it helps.
Thanks a lot, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think it's Miriam.
I would like to follow up on your question, Michael. And I have a question to the economists. When you said that you only are concerned with recalibration, then if you ask a question about life satisfaction, then doesn't it matter to you, or don't you care that at one point in time it may mean economic well-being, other type health or family, that it differs across people or over time within people? It doesn't matter at all to you?
No,
maybe it's not a very neutral question. Maybe I should. I want to put this neutrally, but I mean, so I
don't think it matters in itself. You know, if the thing I care about is life satisfaction, then you know everything is just a means to that end. It might be interesting for the purpose of increasing life satisfaction if you know what its causes are, but I don't care about those things principally. And I think that's sort of, I maybe kind of speak a little bit for the sort of subjective well-being researchers in the room who, so to speak, who think like, okay, this is the thing we're ultimately interested in. How do we get more of that stuff? Okay, Alberto, I think it's, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to join Casper in the effort of not getting lost in translation as an economist. And the way the terms bias is used, I find it a bit confusing sometimes. So in my understanding, I would say that response shift can be considered as a response bias insofar as it's a predictable kind of error. So this means that we have some information, and I absolutely join you there, in the interest of understanding where these shifts come from. But my experience as an economist is that for the moment, we don't understand it very well. So it's basically treated as an error in the sense that we can't really predict how it works. I mean, it's hard. We can't observe the scale. We can't observe latent satisfaction. And it's not really a question. It's more about the question is, would you agree with this use of the term bias with respect to the term error? And if this helps in any way.
Well, I think the important thing is, well, of course, considering it as a bias depends again on your objective and what you want to do and what is important for you. And also, I think what is important is to understand how response shift occurs and why it occurs. And in that sense, for instance, it is true that, in fact, appraisal can inform us on how response shift can occur. And we can also try to understand why response shift occurs. And I think that this might really help to try to really get more insight into the phenomenon, and not only saying that, okay, it's present or it's not, and if it is, okay, it's just measurement bias, I just want to get rid of it, and that's the end of the story. I think we have to go a little bit behind this and really try to understand why it happens and how. So some of the mechanism can help to understand how it can happen. And regarding the why, it can be, is it because of recalibration has occurred? Is it because reprioritization has occurred? And try to put the why and the how together and to really get more insight into what is going on here. And I think this is one important step to really try to take in order to better understand what we are doing and to better interpret the data we are analyzing. But this is a personal thought.
For those who weren't in the earlier session but have since turned up, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions if you'd like to do so. We have 10 further minutes allotted. Okay, Mark's got a hand.
I just wanted to make a very brief point coming back to this biases stuff, particularly how we were discussing it earlier, which is that my sense is that a lot of the happiness economics literature has come out of the broader movement of behavioral economics and kind of getting away from pure rational choice theory and trying to look at real data and this kind of thing. But because of that intellectual heritage, there's an emphasis on cognitive biases. Whereas in fact, I think if you take a more cognitive perspective on these things, you see that communicating your life satisfaction and your life evaluations more broadly is very cognitively difficult. And so we shouldn't necessarily see these things as biases. They're rather the kind of natural byproduct of this kind of very difficult communicative process. And I'm often inclined to think that life satisfaction scales, because they're so rigid, kind of impose biases on that cognitive process. And so I'm very concerned about the use of the word bias, but I like Alberto's kind of very narrow and tight definition of it as kind of systematic error that we could predict. Just a comment, thanks.
I'll give the credit to Daniel Kahneman for the definition.
Any more for any more? We have, okay, Castor, why don't you go, and then Alberto.
I just have a fun suggestion for those of us who are still here tomorrow. I like the idea of a roll call instead of a roll call where everybody explains who they are, where everybody gives a sentence about what they think ultimately matters, because it seems like lots of the disagreements that come up in these conversations are just rooted in people just having different beliefs about what matters and in how far this data kind of relates to what in fact matters. So this is just a suggestion. I mean, we don't have to do it, but I just thought I'd share it because I would find it quite enjoyable.
Can you give an example of what you would answer so I know what you're talking about?
Sure. So I have a simplistic view that I have fully borrowed from Michael Plant, who has convinced me over the past year of that view, which is that there's a single kind of mental state, which we might or type of attribute of mental states, which we might call valence, and value is just instantiated by having more or less valence within your mental states, and that what we should just maximize is how good people just feel. And that's all that there is to it.
You used more than one sentence there, Casper.
I am sorry. I hoped I used very many commas.
Yeah, so I guess, oh, sorry, Alberta, you had a hand.
But did this make sense as the sort of thing I had in mind?
Yes.
Okay.
What comes to mind though is opioid use.
Yes, this is a common critique, but we don't need to open it up.
It's a tough one, huh? But I know what you mean. Thank you.
So I guess I have a follow-up on Casper's question for Veronique and Miriam. So do you take it to be kind of intrinsic moral worth that people's perspectives change? You know, that they think one thing they think is important to their health, and another thing is not? Because I take that as kind of maybe a part of the causal story about what impacts their well-being, maybe a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Veronique, do you want to bite on my comment?
Sorry, can you, sorry, I didn't realize it was a question for me. I'm awfully sorry. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so my question was, do you take it to be of kind of intrinsic moral worth that people's perspectives change on what matters in their life? Because I take those things as being maybe a means to an end of how their life goes for them. But is it kind of intrinsic interest that people, you know, how people assess their health and quality of life changes? Or what the kind of the determinants of their quality of life change?
What could determine quality of life? I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. I have to put on my headphones, I guess.
Okay.
So you mean what determines quality of life for people? No, maybe I don't understand what you are saying.
So we're having this conversation about response shift. So people's perspectives on how they evaluate things changes. But I'm asking if you consider it to be of intrinsic moral importance that people's perspectives change. I'm just trying to get on, kind of follow up further to Casper's point, like is there some sort of differences in interdisciplinary norms about where value lies?
If there's a,
I don't know if other people could hear me or not, but anyway, not important.
Yeah, I really can't hear you very well. I'm awfully sorry. So I couldn't really understand the question.
So Michael, it was indeed difficult to follow, but you mean a moral, you mean moral? And it's
A moral perspective?
But yeah, but maybe just to help, and maybe you can then continue, Veronique. But what your question, as far as I understood it, made me think that if response shift is an effect of adaptation, and that's what we see about how we considered it, then that is something related to resilience, and that is what you really want people to be. So part of life is being able to adapt, and being able to adapt to terrible circumstances and better ones. So yes, I think it's a psychological, it points to its psychological mechanism that is highly human and all, but also needed. Is that the direction you wanted to go into? Or am I?
I'll accept that for an answer. Thank you.
God.
So,
Or is it to say that maybe we shouldn't adapt to everything?
I think Alois has and that'll be the final question.
No, I just a comment on your question. I think this is a very good question, and I think it cannot be answered within the framework of the evaluative question we are trying to study. So this is outside of the. So if we want to evaluate something based on a life satisfaction question, and then Michael, you come up with this question on how different reasons for adaptation should be considered. We cannot respond on this question within the life satisfaction maximization paradigm. This is something we have to judge with additional criteria. And I think this is also how I understood the response to Chris' question when we make use of this appraisal theory, that we then might be better able to make these difficult allocation decisions. But this become additional criteria. And so, yeah, so I very much like your question, Michael. I think this is something leading to the issue that we cannot everything answer within this one evaluative question that we sometimes would like to when we do life satisfaction research.
Okay, so we've now hit 5:30 London time, so that brings us to an end. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today.